So we've considered two objections to Pascal's wager, one concerning the question whether it's possible to form a belief in light of his considerations, another considering the question whether or not a belief thus formed is in a sense mercenary and therefore not legitimate. We've argued that perhaps Pascal would have adequate answers to both of those challenges. Here's another challenge that might cut a little bit deeper though. This is known as the many gods problem. James Cargyle, in an article from the 1960s called Pascal's Wager, asks, putting it sort of tersely, how do we know that the possible owner-operator of the universe is the sort of being who will send religious people to heaven? That is to say, there are a number of questions that are associated with this brief remark. One of them is, yeah, there's a possible state of the world that has a GCB that rewards with eternal bliss all and only people who believe in the GCB, but on the other hand, there might be a very great being, perhaps not the greatest conceivable being, but still a very great being who's possible, that will send to eternal damnation those people who believe in the GCB, a sort of anti-GCB, as it were. That seems like a possibility too. If there's a possibility of a GCB, there's also a possibility of a, let's call, an anti-GCB. And furthermore, there's also the possibility of a GCB who rewards those people who scratch their nose on Tuesday, July 17th, 2017, or something of the kind, right? There are all kinds of possibilities that, with regard to what the state of the world is, that could have implications for your eternal existence, if you have one. So we need to think about what that would imply as to whether it's more practically rational or not to believe in a GCB. Let's think about this in terms of our matrix. I'm adding a couple more columns now. So in addition to the 1% column that says the GCB exists and likes theists, that is to say rewards theists with eternal bliss, we also want to rule in the possibility that there's a GCB that exists, or an anti-GCB, whatever you like to call it, that exists that dislikes or even hates theists, so that if you're a theist in believing in a GCB, then this entity will send you to eternal damnation. Or another possibility that there's no GCB that exists at all. Let's suppose that the GCB existing, the pro-theist GCB and the anti-theist GCB have an equal likelihood of existing, 1% in each case. Let's now run through our numbers for keeping the same utilities that we ascribe to the outcomes as before, and we're going to get 10,000 times 0.01 plus 1 times 0.01 plus 50 times 0.98, giving us 149.01. Compare that with what happens if we're non-theists, that number is going to be the same, 149.01. Again, I need to caution you, my own utilities, 10,000, 1, etc. I'm putting here 50, I'm putting here as a just subjective expression of my own preferences. On the other hand, you'll be wanting to put in your own numbers in order to figure out what this possibility implies for your own line of reasoning. But at least for the probabilities that I'm stipulating here, as well as the values I assign to the various outcomes that I'm stipulating here, I'm going to get that it's just as rational to be a theist as it is to be a non-theist. That is to say, there's nothing particularly compelling about theism if we're talking about practical rationality. Again, you might have a different set of subjective expected utilities based on different values you assign to the outcomes, but you need to be honest, you need to be consistent, and think through what these implications are before looking at the overall column on the far right so that you don't stack the deck in favor of a certain conclusion. But if that's right, then notice that Pascal's wager is, if you don't get radically different numbers from the ones that I get, Pascal's wager is much less compelling than meets the eye at first, because now it seems that if you take into account the various outcomes, different states of the world with regard to the existence of a GCB, anti-theist GCB, etc., it's no longer clear that the practically rational thing to do is to be a theist. So this is known as the many gods objection. If there's one God, as it were, who rewards theists with eternal afterlife, there's also the possibility of another one who rewards theists with something quite different, something much worse. And so why is it more rational to believe in the one than it is to believe in the other? The many gods objection is one that I want to suggest is a powerful challenge to Pascal's wager, and perhaps is a more powerful challenge than the other ones that we've considered. Furthermore, as by way of a final question, we might ask Pascal. We've taken it for granted so far that eternal life is something that would be, at least in heaven, is something that would be very good. So, to quote from Matthew, "And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal." And the suggestion is that eternal life, at least in heaven, will be a very nice thing. But we might wonder whether that goes without saying. What would it be like to live in heaven in such a way as to suppose that I'd be happy there? First of all, what would I do? What would it be like? What sort of happiness would I experience? Would it be the sort of happiness that I experience when I eat a good meal? Well, that seems like I'm not sure I'd be able to appreciate that forever, for eternity. Is it the sort of happiness that I experience when I take pleasure in something good happening to someone that I care about, like a child of mine or my spouse or another loved one? Well, again, those things don't seem to go on forever. There are only finitely many people that I care about, and for each of them, there seems like there's a finite number of good things that can happen in which I can take pleasure. What about activities that I find valuable? Learning something, challenging my mind in such a way as to expand it with a new subject that I'm finding myself excited about, some area of history or science or literature. Those are all great, but again, it's not clear how I could do that for eternity. Some philosophers have suggested that eternal life might get boring after a while. And even if it doesn't get quite boring, its excitement, its newness, its freshness would seem, after many, many, many years, eons perhaps, to begin to pale. And so, whereas some people think about eternal life as infinitely high in utility, as having an unlimited kind of utility, we might suggest perhaps instead that eternal life, in heaven at least, is one that would be very good, but not one that would be infinitely good. Maybe there's a notion that we could draw from economics known as diminishing marginal returns, so that while new things, new experiences are all fine, the newness begins to pale after a while, so that it's a bit more like an asymptote than it is a curve that goes on infinitely upwards. So now, if we take that into account, we might be less sure that Pascal's wager is so compelling, because eternal life is good, but not radically different in kind from the sort of life that we have here on earth, firstly. And secondly, you might appreciate, you might take notice of just how much in our lives we value, precisely because they seem to be based on life's fragility, life's contingency. Think about the sorts of things that you might like to do by way of recreation that are interesting, exciting, and valuable, partly because they're a little bit risky. So going out into the wilderness, exploring, it might be the part of what you value in that is precisely that you're getting away from all the supports and safety networks and so forth of civilization. The sheer edginess of certain kinds of our activities seems to come from the fact that something bad could happen. We might even risk our lives in certain situations. That's what adds to the charm of some of those activities for some of us. I'm not suggesting that you go become a daredevil, that you go put your life at risk, but I'm suggesting that part of what gives us, that we find valuable in certain of our experiences, is precisely the fact that they are predicated upon our finitude, upon the very fact that in certain circumstances we could lose our lives. Now those sorts of experiences are probably not ones that we could have in heaven by means of eternal bliss. And so it's not clear whether that bliss is one that's all that it's made out to be. It's not as if eternal bliss could be something that could occur by virtue, for example, of my spending a lot of time on a high wire where if I fell I would die, because there's no such thing as dying in heaven. So that's one point. Another point is the following. Eternal damnation, is it so terrible? That is to say, we're often described, or have described to us, eternal damnation as something that involves a huge amount of torture and physical pain. But on the other hand, that's different from the sort of displeasure that you experience when you feel you've done something terrible. Think about the difference between physical suffering, in which you feel like your flesh is burning, or in which you've got an internal organ that has become very unpleasant, very uncomfortable because it's malfunctioning, for example. That's pain, all right, and it's bad. but many of us would probably say that those sorts of pains are not as bad as the kind of pain, so to speak, that you might feel when you, for example, have done something wrong knowingly and willfully. That is to say, many of us feel that I suffer more if I do something, for example, vicious, unkind, cruel to someone else. But that's my own conscience making me suffer, as opposed to something physical happening to me. Now, if I'm sent to hell because I failed to believe in a GCB, it's not clear to me if my failure to believe in a GCB is because I didn't have enough evidence, that is, theoretical rationality couldn't get me to believe in a GCB. If I didn't believe in a GCB and the GCB sent me after Judgment Day to eternal damnation, wouldn't I still have a clear conscience? I haven't been cruel. I haven't been mean or vicious. I haven't caused somebody to suffer in order to get pleasure from their doing so, for example. I've got my conscience with me. Granted, I will suffer a lot of physical pain, presumably, but that's not as bad as it could be, at least for me, as the pain that I would experience if I felt that I had knowingly and willfully done something wrong. Firstly and secondly, at least according to the sorts of pains that most of us are familiar with, pain is something that we tend to protect against after a while. That is to say, there is such a thing as chronic pain, but we learn to live with it. What would it be exactly to experience eternal and enormous, unlimited amounts of physical suffering? After a while, maybe you'd get used to it. It might be unpleasant, but it's not so clear that it would be as bad as the theistic tradition, at least in the West, makes it out to be. So again, I'm asking you to think a little bit more circumspectly about the everyday common sense notions, for example, of heaven and hell, and ask whether they are respectively as great and, for the case of hell, as awful as popular culture and many theistic traditions make them out to be. Doing so requires thinking more clearly about two particular issues that we'll develop in the coming lectures for this course. Firstly, about the nature of right and wrong, what it is to do something right, what it is to do something wrong, and beyond that, what it is to be a person persisting through time. When I'm a person persisting through time, what is the relationship between a later stage of myself, for example, and the current stage of myself? We need to get clear about those questions in order to figure out precisely what the goodness of heaven or the badness of hell actually consist in. In a more immediate context, what we'll move on to in our next lecture is precisely the nature of evil and how many allege that the existence of evil in one form or another is proof not of the existence of a GCB, but rather the opposite. Many people, that is, want to say that the existence of evil shows that there can't be any GCB, can't be any greatest conceivable being that allows evil to exist in the world. That's what we'll move on to next.